Hello, welcome to our Sunday presentation for the Theosophical Society in Portland. My name is Ron Karsten. I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Theosophical Society here in Portland. Our speaker today is Dr. Thomas Mather. He's a world-renowned theosophist from Tennessee. He's a longtime student of religion and Tibetan Buddhists. Dr. Mather is a life member of the Theosophical Society, and he works with Gurdjieff groups in Nashville. And he's the secretary of the Theosophical Society there. He holds a PhD in philosophy that he received in Vanderbilt University. His degrees are in philosophy, history of religion, and cognitive science. He spent his youth in Germany. He's been a college professor and an academic researcher for 27 years in ancient Asian philosophy and religion. Additionally, he studied under the Tantric and Taoist teachers that he could find, and it was since 1976. He's had plenty of time to get this thing right today. He's authorized to teach in each of those traditions. We're pleased to have Dr. Mather with us today to talk about Buddhism. So he's going to work with us here, and we're going to slide over to our PowerPoint here just now. Let's see. There we go, Doctor. We are recording. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about HPB and her discoveries in Tibet.
Thomas, could you please get the microphone over next to you so we can hear you?
Should we start over?
Nope, but this is beautiful. Go ahead, run with it now.
Okay, we're going to talk about HPB, Esoteric Buddhism. Esoteric Buddhism is supposedly a northern tradition that predates the Buddhism of Siddhartha Gautama. And she would have likely encountered this in Tibet. Next slide, please. So, when we were rehearsing this with Ron and earlier time before today, I had dinner guests, and one of them, who's a skeptic about everything, he loves to argue, Vanderbilt professor, said, well, everyone knows that HPB did not make it to Tibet. And if she had any knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan traditions, she had read in books. Going, really? Really? As a philosopher, if you say everyone knows, that means you got my goat and I'm going after you. I'm going to cross-examine what you mean by everyone knows. Anyway, there's British sources saying she was refused at the border, so she was making an attempt. There's a British source that says they noted her exit from Tibet. So that's one source where we know she was in Tibet. Academically, the internationally renowned scholar of Buddhism, D.T. Suzuki, mainly known for his stuff on Zen Buddhism, said that HPB knew more about Tibetan Buddhism than would have been available to Western scholars at the time. She could have only known as much as she did if she actually got into Tibet and met Tibetan teachers. It had to be a first personal experience. There was simply no books at the time for her to read and have sort of a secondhand knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism. The ninth Panchen Lama paid for and had his staff prepare the 1927 edition of HPB's The Voice of Silence, in which, at his request, a handwritten poem by him in Tibetan calligraphy was inserted into this edition. He states that his staff checked her translation from the Tibetan. Western academia says it's not a translation from anything. Well, if you have the Panchen Lama saying they were checking her translation, then there is a Tibetan original. They also checked her added commentary material for accuracy. They had no complaints, and adding commentarial material in translating a Tibetan Buddhist text, even within the context of Tibet, is normal. He also states that his predecessor, the eighth Panchen Lama, knew her very well, and she studied with him for many years at Tashi Lungpo. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Panchen Lama monastery. It's a very elaborate structure, so this picture doesn't give you the full extent of just how extensive the monastery is in Shigatse, Tibet. Next slide. Now, before we get into A.P. Sinnett, we should point out that the most likely route that she could have gotten in Tibet that was not under British control was through Nepal or Bhutan, and people laugh. Academics say, well, she needed to have a mountain pack and order food supplies, and there's no evidence of that. And the Mahatmas and Blavatsky said they entered through on horse. Well, you can enter through Tibet on horse if you're following the river from Nepal into, and there's plenty of villages and markets, not only today, but back then, where you can enter into southwestern Tibet, which is where Shigatse is, and get to the Panchen Lama monastery. The earliest expression of the teachings that you find in the Secret Doctrine is the publication of Esoteric Buddhism in 1888 by A.P. Sinnett. Western academics immediately criticized it for not being Buddhism at all. The system presented it did not match any form of Buddhism known at the time. The paradigm for what was known as Buddhism at the time was Theravada Buddhism. I have to note, in future reference, there's two main branches of Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana. Theravada Buddhism is of the Hinayana branch. Mahayana is something that looks closer to Theosophy, but is still different. Next slide. Now, at the very beginning, in which academia was learning more and more about Buddhism, the original Buddhism controversy arose about the same time that the critics were getting on A.P. Sinnett. The husband and wife team shown on this slide were founders of the Pali Text Society and were experts on Theravada Buddhism. There's still academic awards made out in their name for any further research or excellence in presenting, discovering things about Theravada Buddhism. But they point out that Theravada Buddhism was not original Buddhism. It emerged along with 18 early schools. Sometimes you can say it's 20 or 21 schools, but basically 18 schools of Hinayana Buddhism. As the Buddhist oral traditions, I emphasize oral traditions, were being committed to writing. As soon as they were being committed to writing, you had 18 different forms of Buddhism. The controversy that generated the 18 schools was, what did the Buddha mean about ana-atman, or no self? They're pretty solid on the sutras, which we'll get to in the next slide. It's the Abhidharma that is the problem and is the source of the 18 schools. Next slide, please. All right. Part of the issue of original Buddhism is there is a short chronology and there's a long chronology, and this is from the earliest Buddhist texts we have. There is either a 100 or a 300-year gap between the time of the Buddha and our earliest empirical data, which means the written texts of the 18 schools. If you ever played the game of telephone or watched children play the game of telephone, you might know what the problem is with an oral tradition. And we see this when this oral tradition is written down in 18 different versions. The problem of original Buddhism is still discussed by scholars to the present time. Most scholars cautious about their academic reputation, display a historical Gnosticism about what can be said about Buddhism in its first or 300 years. Another part of the problem is originally what was meant by ana-atman, or no self. And you have 18 different schools emerging precisely on that issue. Next slide. Hinayana Buddhism organizes its scriptures in terms of three baskets. The first is the sutras, which are supposed to contain the teachings of the Buddha. The second is the Vinaya, which contain the rules of discipline for Buddhist monastics and also lay persons. The third, and the most controversial, is Abhidharma. The third basket is where the problems arrive. Abhidharma is each school's spin and defense of its interpretation of Buddhist teaching, particularly of what did ana-atman mean, no self mean. One early school, the Sautrantikas, they're also known as the Sutravadins, which means sutras only, no Abhidharma crap, rejected Abhidharma altogether as not Buddha word. It is basically the different Buddha schools spinning their own interpretation. So the other schools, besides the Sautrantikas, which did not create Abhidharma, create their own Abhidharma. So we had like 17 Abhidharma texts. as part of the early Buddhist scriptures. Most Abhidharma texts are now lost. Only 2 survive. The one that's in the better shape is the Theravada text. But given the early Buddhist debates amongst themselves, it looks like the Theravada is pretty close to what most of those Buddhist schools believed in. Next slide. So, Abhidharma is the attempt of each school to justify its interpretation of the teaching about Atman, or no self. And there was continuous controversy for thousands of years over what the Buddha meant. Abhidharma in the surviving texts say only momentary states exist. There's no continuous person or personal identity over time. Each instant dies to be replaced by a subsequent state or a copy. There's also a radical depersonalization into causes and conditions that's part of the project. Now, in the original Star Trek, there's a debate that Dr. McCoy has with the transporter, and people saying the transporter is safe. Because Dr. McCoy is not assured that when he's disintegrated in the transporter beam on Starship Enterprise, that he isn't annihilated, and that the person on the planet that sincerely believes it's the continuation of Dr. McCoy is a perfect copy. But Dr. McCoy was annihilated. And when that Dr. McCoy on the planet is beamed back up to the Enterprise, that Dr. McCoy is annihilated. But the new Dr. McCoy on the Starship Enterprise sincerely believes he's the continuation of that earlier 2 Dr. McCoys. The original one on the Enterprise, the one on the planet, and then the one on the Enterprise again. And this essentially is the problem that is being debated over Abhidharma texts. If momentary states alone exist, if there's no continuity, who or what reincarnates? If there's no personal identity or continuity of a person over time, why would the future momentary person be held morally accountable for what a past momentary person did? How can there be karma? There's the old cafeteria joke about the person had a line saying the person at the end line is going to pay, and the second person picks up on it and says the person at the line is going to pay, and the third person in the line says the person at the line is going to pay. And if you're at the end of the line, you're screwed. Anyway, if there is no continuity, how could the person that sets out on the spiritual path to become a Buddha, the Eightfold Path, become a Buddha? Would the momentary state before enlightenment that created Buddha, would it be the same person? And the Buddhists were all, these early schools were all debating this in terms of trying to interpret no self. There was one school that said some kind of continuous person or self did exist, and this school was the Pugalavadins, usually translated as personalists in Western languages. Pugala means person. Sanskrit equivalent, this is Pugala is actually the Southern Buddhist language. Classical Sanskrit would say Purusha. Anyway, at one point, they were the largest school in India. Their monasteries include fully 3/4 of the Buddhist monks in India, and it lasted for 1,200 years. They disappeared because of the Muslim invasions. They were mainly a northern Buddhist school. Next slide. I mentioned that the personalists were a northern Buddhist school. We find changes in Indian Buddhism occurring mainly in the northern schools. And there's a number of reasons for this, but major question is, why in the north? What's going on in the north? And the suspicion is there is an outside source modifying these traditions. There's a outside northern source modifying the traditions of the northern Buddhist schools as they arose in India. And that's the source we're going to be looking at later. The changes in Buddhism that occur in the northern schools include the development of a higher permanent principle instead of momentary states in sentient beings called bodhicitta, buddhadhatu, tatagarbha, and these develop out of the personalist school, but it's not identical to their concept of persons for two main reasons. It does not reincarnate this higher Buddha principle. It is only reflected in its lower emanation, which does reincarnate, and the higher principle incorporates what is the value in this lower principle or lower incarnation. It is also the potential to become a Buddha. No more than an acorn can become a pine tree. The acorn is destined to be a Buddha. The idea of this higher, particularly with the Tathagata Garbha concept, is you somehow have to be potentially and already in embryonic form a Buddha in order to become a Buddha. This higher principle in the Buddhist texts really resembles the theosophical concept of the upper triad or the Atma Buddhi manas. And one Buddha Sutra, shown on the screen, notoriously or famously calls this bodhicitta the Atman. I'll make one comment about bodhicitta that's kind of practical practice relevance. It's also a synonym in Sanskrit for conscience. And even the English word conscience means with consciousness. With consciousness? With what? Well, it comes from an older tradition that you can find in the Platonists and Neoplatonists. This older tradition also claims to be influenced by this northern source. It means, if you ever heard the expression people get under your skin, it's because in terms of this concept, they are inside us. What conscience is not some individual sense of right or wrong. It is the fact that everyone, all living beings, are inside us and witness what we do, and we have some awareness that what we do, they're aware of. Call it inner sympathy. That's what the Neoplatonists call it. That's what some of the Buddhists call it. Some of the Buddhists call it telepathy. But conscience is the fact we're not alone inside ourselves. Everybody's there with us. And part of bodhicitta means, as conscience, is that as a potential Buddha, there's one Buddha nature, but there's an infinite number of Buddhas, and they're all in inner contact with each other. Next slide. So, what's going on with these northern Buddhist schools of Indian provenance? The North has a tradition that claims it's a primordial esoteric Buddhism. There's Russian, Siberian, Mongolian, Persian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist legends of a hidden land or alternative dimension whose entrance is somewhere north of the Kunlun Mountains, and a primordial teaching comes from it. And the similarities that these traditions have indicate that they've had a common source. Next slide. Shambhala is the name most commonly used. It's known also by three other names: Uttarakuru, Omo Lungren, and the Western Garden Palace of Shui Wang Mu. The reason we can make these different names equivalent of each other is because in texts, they show up together as designating the same place. Next slide. Shambhala is supposed to be a place west of China and north of Tibet in the Kunlun Mountains, or at least its physical entry point is there. It is supposed to be an alternative dimension or plane. It is a future New Age and evolutionary phase. Interestingly enough, predicted to be in when the iron bird flies, it will be born where the lands the red men are, which many are now taken to be America. Compare that with the new emergence of a new race in Theosophy. And it is a state of consciousness that we all potentially already have. The journey to Shambhala, if you go there physically, is supposed to be a journey within consciousness of a certain meditative path. You won't find the physical entrance to it unless you've done that meditational path. But if you don't take the physical pilgrimage, that meditative path will take you there even if you haven't journeyed to the mountains of north of Tibet. Next slide, please. This is a collation of texts found in Birnbaum, The Way to Shambhala. so I'll just read it. Shambhala is supposed to holds the highest mystical teachings. It lies hidden north of Tibet behind a great wall of snow mountains. According to prophecy, when religion has died out in the world outside, a great king and teacher of bone, which is the name of this esoteric Buddhism, will once again come forth from Omo Lungren. He will bring mankind a new form of the old spiritual teachings. Piety will decrease day by day until the earth will be wholly depraved. Then property alone will confer rank. Kind of sounds like our day. Wealth will be the only source of devotion. Sounds like our day. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Hopefully, we're not there yet. Falsehood will be the only means of success in litigation. I think we're starting to see that. Earth will be venerated for its mineral resources. Yeah, I think we're already there. After a great battle with the forces of light from Shambhala, led by Kalki, Rudran, Chakran, defeat the forces of darkness, he will reestablish righteousness upon the earth. And the minds of those who live at the end of the age of strife shall be awakened. And what the text means here is their minds will be clear and super concentrated upon the good. The men who are thus changed shall be the seeds of a race of the golden age. This golden age will be an evolved race, this is important, that will be better and higher than the past. You don't find this in Buddhism. And the new race will be spiritually more advanced, and the enlightenment possible will be, and this is a quote from Kamtru Rinpoche, better than anything that has happened before. So somebody became a Buddha in the past and reached the upper limit of what was possible at that stage of evolution. In this new age, they have further development to undergo. Next slide. Now, in that quote, there's some interesting distinctive features that make it appear not to be originally a Buddhist legend, at least Buddhism coming from Siddhartha Gautama. Rather, to the extent it's Buddhist, the Buddhists absorbed it later. First of all, unlike Buddhism, the world is at war between the forces of light and darkness. These forces, actually, in Shambhala teachings, are forces of the past. They're stragglers from a prior universe that fell behind their evolutionary cycle. And basically, the point is in the present, and we'll get onto this in the next slide, we're talking about Kala Chakra, is for human beings, the past and the future are at conflict with each other. They're at war with each other. Evolution means we move towards the future. And so that means, is the present merely a continuation of the past, a creature of the past, and the future is a creature of the past? Or does something new enter in? Is there a future that provides opportunities and forms of development that the past could not give us. It's the present that allows the transformation of our life in the present moment as just a mere continuation of the past into something new, sparking a new future if we overcome the forces of the past. Now, there's a messianic figure that comes from Shambhala to defeat the forces of darkness, but these forces basically are stragglers from a prior universe that have fallen behind in their evolution. Does that sound like Theosophy? Then if we have this older legend, then Theosophy has some sources that predate it, and it's not just something made up by HPB. Also, unlike Buddhism, with the introduction of the Golden Age, you have a new human race that emerges, and its potential is greater than the past. Sounds like Theosophy to me. And that means whatever maximum enlightenment Buddha's had in the past, they're to undergo another course of evolution. The other thing in this teaching is a new Buddha becomes the universe for the evolution of beings that participate within him or her. In Buddhism, you become a Buddha. End of story. In this teaching, it's the beginning of a new chapter. And this makes the Shambhala teaching resemble early Theosophy more than it does Buddhism. Or it makes Theosophy look like it has a source other than Buddhism. And this source also describes itself as esoteric Buddhism, going back to the A.P. Sinnett book that caused controversy. So, can it be that this Northern esoteric Buddhism, also known as Bon, and emerging from Shambhala, is what HPB encountered? There were two monasteries where we know HPB got into that were in the Shigatse region. And to the extent Theosophy is different from Tibetan Buddhism, even the Tibetan Buddhism of the Panchen Lama at the monastery she stayed at. She was in close proximity to these other two monasteries in the Shigatse region of Tibet. Next slide. The teachings of Shambhala, which are supposed to be the primordial esoteric Buddhism that is the source of the two highest tantras in Tibetan Buddhism, Hatha Yoga and Kala Chakra. And when I talked about the past and the future, we're talking about Kala Chakra. These are the two highest tantras found in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet, Bon. This teaching is supposed to be the esoteric teaching of the indigenous religions of Siberia, Mongolia, and the Chinese people. And we can kind of see some of this in the fact that going back to the Neolithic age, some of the same rituals, some of the same dances amongst shamans, Taoist priests, Bon priests, Mongolian shamans and priests have the same ritual and dance or walk that symbolizes the cosmic north and the Big Dipper going around it. It's called the Great Bear Dance because in all these traditions, it's the Great Bear Dance. And the writing system that HPB describes as sensar, we don't have an example of that, but she will talk about white and black dots arranged in a certain sequence. That's also found in these traditions. For example, in the I Ching, where we had the solid and broken lines, you had white and black dots. Amongst the Pythagoreans, who a scholar that we'll mention soon says was probably in contact with this northern tradition, their number symbolism, saying the secret to the whole universe was number, was a series of white and black dots arranged in a certain way. And we can find this on Chinese carved shells dating back to the Neolithic age. But we can find it with the Siberian shamans and the early bone tradition. So we have other forms of evidence saying there's a common northern tradition that these descendant traditions have come from. Peter Kingsley, internationally acclaimed scholar with many books, has in his recent book, claims this tie to Shambhala is also known to the Greeks as the land of the Hyperboreans. And from Hyperborea came Abaris to meet Pythagoras. And he argues that this Tibetan tradition is responsible for Pythagorean and Platonic traditions in Greece. Abaris flew, whatever that means, from Siberia to Greece to meet Pythagoras. The masters of the Abaris tradition and in Siberian shamanism, Mongolian and Chinese traditions, and Bon, are called skywalkers. And Lucas got this via Joseph Campbell as a name for the Jedi Knights, or at least Luke Skywalker. And that's also documented, just like Shambhala appears in Hollywood as Shangri-La in the movie Lost Horizons. Dmitry Ermakov argues convincingly that the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism more or less are a mixture of Indian Buddhism and this northern esoteric tradition that's modified it. The more or less is to what extent was this northern school a influence on them. Now, as both scholars know, Peter Kingsley and Dmitry Ermakov, there was a strong persecution of this northern tradition by Indian Buddhism. If you have any acquaintance with the Star Trek series from the 1980s with the Borg, the Buddhists were acting sort of like the Borg. You shall be assimilated. You shall be assimilated. And the very first Dalai Lama, we think of Dalai Lamas as peaceful, but the very first Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, launched a genocide program against this northern tradition with the help of the ruler Ata Khan. This documented in Kingsley's book. And while things had calmed down by the 19th century, there was still strong persecution of this tradition by Tibetan Buddhists until the rise of the Rime movement. That R-I-M-E word is in Tibetan, Rime, tolerance movement. And even today, there's discrimination against the bone, and even today, the 14th Dalai Lama resists admitting this past. Now, HPB appears to have some difficulties with the Tibetan authorities. The suggestion is that's with the central government of the Dalai Lama. And maybe it's because she was searching for sources other than the Gelugpa tradition that the Dalai Lama represents, namely the bone tradition that she would have found in Shigatse. Next slide, please. Okay, bone, the esoteric Buddhism of the North, says there's different types of bone. There's Dome bone, it's translated as the primordial bone. That's the very structure of the universe. It's inescapable. The universe is a stacked deck of cards. It's operating in terms of certain purposes and goals that all the beings within a universe can't fight against. Otherwise, it's bad karma. Karma, as a universal law, is the expression of what the very nature of the universe is. Then there's Jungdrung, called swastika bone, and this is supposed to be the earliest tradition we know of teachings coming from Shambhala. So these are actual teaching traditions. And it was taught by a Buddha from Shambhala named Tongpong Shenrab. Tongpong is an older name for Buddha, which spread from Central Asia to the kingdom of Zanzun. Zanzun was a major empire early on, incorporated parts of Persia, Central Asia, and Western Tibet, some parts of Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Tajikistan. And later it shrunk with the Tibetan Empire, which Tibet used to be much bigger in territory than it is now. So currently now, Zanzun is just now part of Western Tibet. And it is one of the centers where bone exists to this day. And in the day of HPB, it also existed in the Swat Valley of Pakistan until the rise of the Taliban. And Tongpo Shenrab is supposed to predate the Buddha by centuries. Thousands of years. Then bone says there's bone sarma, and this is bone mixed with Indian Buddhism. And note, all forms of Tibetan Buddhism are supposed to be a mixture of Indian Buddhism and this northern tradition. And the oldest Tibetan Buddhist school, which is the Nyingmapas, they're closer to Bon than the other Buddhist schools, and as sort of as we'll protect you, we won't kill you if you become part of us. A number of the Bon Sarma lamas were incorporated into Nyingmapa Buddhism, or the Tibetan Buddhist school of the Nyingmapas at the time that the founder of that school was operating. Next slide. This is the summary slide. I'm going to try to suggest here that the northern esoteric form of primordial Buddhism, known in Tibet as Bon, as the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet, that Theosophy and Bon coming from Shambhala, is closer together than Theosophy and Buddhism. Now, there's some PDF files I've uploaded, or Ron has uploaded, to the Theosophical Society Portland website, in which the suggestion is, and following up what HPB said, which was that the Tibetan Buddhist canon of scriptures were an exoteric commentary upon the exoteric or inner core of teachings that reflected this esoteric Buddhism, of which Tibetan Buddhism is the outer teaching of. So, both Theosophy and Bon claim to be expressions of a primordial tradition. The Buddhism that arises in India claims it originated with Siddhartha Gautama. Bon will say the Buddhism of Siddhartha Gautama is just an expression of this primordial tradition, but then the Buddha's followers say, when you have the rise of the 18 schools, no, it originated with Siddhartha Gautama. Both Theosophy and Bon claim there is a war between powers of light and darkness, at least in early Theosophy. Theosophy has sort of become new-aged over time and lost some of the earlier themes, and trying to understand these earlier themes. There's no such theme in Buddhism. Both Theosophy and Bon say there's an evolutionary process of new and higher races, new and higher enlightened beings than possible in the earlier age, that karma actually has a purpose of spiritual growth. You don't find that in Buddhism. Reincarnation is just an endless round of futility to be liberated from. Once liberated, end of story. You're a Buddha. Theosophy and Bon claim there's a higher immortal principle that does not reincarnate. What reincarnates is an emanation, and the higher principle absorbs what is of value of those lower lives and personalities. Buddhism did not originally have this idea. It appears later in the northern schools and appears under the terminology of bodhicitta, Buddhadhatu, or Tatagarbha. But it appears to be coming from outside of Buddhism itself. In Theosophy and Bone, upon enlightenment, a Buddha becomes the universe for nurturing towards enlightenment, towards future evolution, the life forms that are a part of that Buddha. This idea gradually appears in Buddhism, along with the idea of a higher principle, mainly in Chinese Buddhism. The elements of reality in Theosophy and Bone are one, which is subdivided to become 5 or 7. The elements of reality in Buddhism are 5. Everything's organized around 5. The 5 skandhas, which are the elements of the psycho-mental flux. The 5 elements correlated to the 5 skandhas, and the 5 dimensions of a Buddhist mandala. In addition, Theosophy and Bone have something that you won't find in Buddhism, and that's the concept of Fohat. Now, Fohat, HPB says, comes from a Turkish, Finnish, Ugarian tradition. It's the same body of language. You can find it in Tibetan as Foha, and there it's a tantric practice mantra and mudra. It's a gesture. I have to go a little bit into Tantra. This may embarrass some theosophists. First of all, the general academic literature and popular literature about Tantra in the West contrasts the left-hand path and the right-hand path. And saying the right-hand path is non-sexual and the left-hand path is the sexual path. That's not correct. Both the right-hand path involve symbolization, the left-hand path involves symbolization. The right-hand path involves actual sex, just as the left-hand path. The difference between the left and the right is if the Tantra involves one's spouse, the preliminary ceremony leading up to the actual sex, she sits on your right. If it is somebody you're not married to, even if you're visualizing it, so it's left hand. Anyway, in that ceremony, there's an understanding that the potential for manifestation from the absolute is going to be a separation of the one into a father-mother principle, a bipolar principle. And the separation and yet the attraction to come back together, that is the arousal between the two principles, called kama, love, lust. In those traditions, is also an aspect of foha. not Fohat. I haven't got to Fohat yet. And it is with the nature of that energy that you actually have a manifestation that is also a process of return, the great breath, when manifestation starts. So in that early ritual, before you're having sex, there is a mudra of exhalation, fo, and inhalation, ha, fo, ha, while your tantric partner is sitting a few feet away from you. And this symbolizes the relation between the father and mother principle, but it's also in the practice attuning oneself to the great breath. Fo, ha, fo, ha. You won't find that in Buddhism. Well,
Thank you very much, Thomas, for sharing this important information with us today on HPB and the Tibetan Buddhism. Ladies and gentlemen, the Portland Theosophical Society will have another program that'll come out for us, and it will be in the third Sunday of November. I'll send out information to each of you to invite you to the development of the Kabbalah is the next one, and our speaker is one of the leading Masons here in the Portland area who has really got some experience. He's in Egypt right now taking pictures, getting ready for the presentation so that he'll have a really good bag full of things for you to notice. So thank you again, Dr. Mather. You've been great for speaking with us for this wonderful topic. And everybody, please, and thank you for a wonderful day.